Welcome, everybody. Today we're talking about what happens in New York at the end of World War II. This is a huge step. Next week, we'll be looking at 4 or 5 different individual artists who really sort of summarize all of the ideas we've been talking about in relation to modernism. So it'll be a good review, but also look at individual artists who are influenced by all of this, but yet were never actually members of a single particular group. And they're very important artists. In fact, we just miss them. And then the very last class will be a look at postmodernism. What happens from here on? Once modernism's gone, we get into the 60s. What does that term mean? How can we have a context for understanding what's happening like now? I mean, I never teach really contemporary art because, first of all, I'm a historian. I need historic context. I don't believe I can analyze what's happening now. It's happening now. How do I possibly have the context to understand it? That's for somebody in the future to sort of figure out. So I shy away from it on that reason, because I'm not an art critic. Some art historians will teach very contemporary art and they're comfortable with it, and I'm just not. But I can absolutely give you the foundation of postmodern art in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and how it got started. And from that, you can see yourself all the different things that are happening today. So let me move this out of the way so we can see and talk about New York. Now, this is such an important moment for so many reasons. You know, it's immediately after World War II ends. I have to say something about World War II. When we looked at World War I and its impact, it was quite profound. The impact of World War I on society was very, very important. It had sort of a traumatic fallout. It affected the art world very dramatically with people, images of the war, the idea that the world was sort of beginning anew. And we do not have the traumatic impact after World War II that we had after World War I. Even though it was a bigger war and there was more damage and more people died, and it was horrific in many ways, it didn't leave the same trauma on people unless they were personally involved. Obviously, for many, many people, there's a personal involvement. Of course, it was traumatic. But for the rest of society, the one reason why it didn't was because it was much clearer as a war. People understood World War II. There was no question why we're fighting, why people were risking their lives. I was never clear in World War I. It's a lot easier to live with and go out and risk your life and live with that when you know why you're doing it and you believe in why you're doing it. And for that reason, it's a different mark. The mark that is remaining is not the same. Will you close the door right there? There is a sign right on the door. Anyway, now I've completely lost track of what I was talking about. Okay, so we're not going to be looking at art. There is a sign. Yeah, go ahead and close. Good idea. Thank you. Yeah, and if there are people, they can go ahead and knock, and that'll be fine. So we're not going to be seeing like traumatic images of warfare and all of that. We are going to see changes, but it has more to do with the movement from Europe to America than anything else. That's going to be the biggest influence. I've already alluded to the fact that by 1939, when the war begins in Europe, Europeans are flooding to this country. Many earlier, especially German artists, there are a number of German artists that started coming over much earlier in the 30s, and we'll talk about one of them in particular. Their presence in New York is powerful during the war, not only in terms of their art, but just their physical presence. They formed the artist groups. They knew how to be a group of artists. They knew how to interact. And they sort of taught these young Americans how to behave as artists, how to form groups, and how to have comradeship, and just, it just brought them into a different level of sort of art making than they really had in New York prior to this. What they're going to bring with them is predominantly three styles that dominated the modern art world in Europe. The earliest was the expressive. That was the pre-World War I style that Kandinsky, that continues on. The constructive style, which is born out of sort of Cubism and the like, but turned into this utopian, optimistic style for imagery for this new utopian world. And then the surreal, that's the third major influence. Now, almost all the surrealists were in New York through the whole war, and they were very visible and very vocal. So their input is profound, and the Americans know all about them, and they're very influenced by them. There were fewer of the constructivists, but Mondrian was here. Mondrian came over and was an important presence in New York in the 40s, and his presence alone was powerful. While Kandinsky wasn't here, those influenced by Kandinsky were, and particularly one artist we're going to talk about in detail, Hans Hofmann, and we'll talk about him in a moment. He brings the ideas of Kandinsky and also of the Bauhaus. Now let's talk about this generation. What we're really talking about is the Beat generation, the Beats, the 50s. These are the people. And if you understand sort of Beat culture, this was hard to teach to a bunch of undergraduates. They didn't know what the heck I was talking about. They don't know who beatniks were, and they don't understand the Beat movement. They don't even know who hippies were, let alone the Beats before them. But hopefully many of you still remember what I'm talking about. So this is the Beat generation. It's poets, it's musicians, it's avant-garde artists of all kinds, very avant-garde music during this period, as well as poetry and painting. Now, what they're doing is actually surprisingly romantic. They had a very overall romantic ideal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. First of all, in terms of what they say, the sort of stance they take, they're against everything. They're anti any kind of system. I mean, European art was all about systems. Constructivists had their system, surrealists have their system, their gods and things that influence them, but they just rejected all of it. First thing they're going to reject is the social visionaries of the 30s. And this is very American, because Europeans didn't really have to live with this. But in America, these guys have been indoctrinated with the Federal Arts Project. Many of them worked on the Federal Arts Project, were forced to work in this social realist style that we looked at last time. They're going to instantly reject that and react against that very, very strongly. That's a system, it's a politicized art form to aggrandize America and culture. And so they're going to be against that. They're going to be against psychoanalysis of the surrealists, because Freud is a system, he's a system. This means this, you follow this. They're going to reject that openly. They're going to reject the constructivist ideal, particularly the impersonal nature. Constructivism is very impersonal. It's cold, flat, hard edges. There's nothing personal in them. It's sort of like technology, the machine aesthetic. They're going to reject that. Now, does that mean their art has nothing to do with these things? Absolutely not. They're totally influenced by all of these things. They're just saying they're not. They're just openly, I'm not accepting any system. But we'll see. There
came back. Okay.
Was a weak system again. Are we losing our
screen blacked out not for a second, but came back.
Yeah. Okay. That's what did it. Maybe I'm wobbly. Make sure everything's plugged in. Okay. What they do embrace of all the European ideals is one of the earliest, the expressive, that early kind of pre-World War I expressionism, which is really a German conception. And remember, the earliest artists who came over were German in the 30s, and they're going to embrace that. But that's very much a sort of American sensibility, more than the constructivists are, and even more than the surrealists are. Those are really predominantly European. They're also going to, by the 50s, be caught up in the existential philosophies that governed the Beats. The whole Beat generation was about existentialism, and that's going to get fed into this expressive art. Particularly, they're embracing these personal responsibility, and that's what one of the things that's going to turn them against surrealism very strongly, because surrealists rejected all personal responsibility. Surrealists believed that art was above and beyond the ordinary things in life, and that artists didn't have any responsibility to talk about the world. You could just turn inward to your psyche. But the American artists are going to reject that entirely, very strongly. So the three voices, there are three people who are largely responsible for framing our understanding of this era. When I say voices, I mean these are teachers, these are writers, these are critics, these are theorists, these are people who lay out what this generation is doing. This is a very important age. The 50s is an important decade for a number of reasons. I'm attracted to the 50s because I see parallels to the 20s. It has a lot of similarities. They're both the first decade after a major war. So there's a lot of optimism. There's a lot of rebuilding. The optimism, I mean, gosh, I grew up in the 50s. Everything was so idealistic in the 50s. I mean, I was brainwashed, right, on the 50s. What life was like, father knows best and leave it to be. I mean, you're just brainwashed on this American ideal, this American dream. And those ideals are going to create some sort of reaction. This is a great age of art theory. Now,
Everybody was having a lot of babies.
in the 50s, oh gosh, yeah, the boom. Every year, I was born in 47. Every year of my life, in every grade I was in, we doubled from the class before, from the year before. I mean, I remember there were years going to school. We had to have classes in church basements one year, and another year in another building. They were just they never caught up with us until by the time I got to high school, they'd had enough time to realize they're coming, build some new schools. But yeah, absolutely. But art theory, which is what a lot of these people were doing, is very different from art criticism. Art criticism is where you're analyzing, writing, talking about the art that's made or being made now. Art theory is you're not talking about anything that's already been done. You're talking about what should be done. You're talking about what art should be, where art should be going. And it's a really great age for art theory. And these guys really combine that. Hans Hofmann, we're going to look at, he's also an artist, and he came over very early in the 30s. And we're going to talk about him in just a minute in more detail and look at his art. He's probably the single most important influence on what's happening in America. Clement Greenberg, the art critic of the 50s and into the 60s. If you study this period, you have everything Greenberg wrote. He's also writing in the 30s, late 30s. Very, very important voice.
I think he was the one that I heard speak at the Nelson and blast Thomas Hart Benton.
Wow, really? That was, boy.
I think it was.
When was this?
Well, a long time ago.
It could very well have been, because he would have done that. Benton would have been his antichrist.
Oh, yeah, he was.
Yeah. Wow, I wish I'd have heard that.
And he said he was well, I don't know. He just raved on about how Benton was an anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
And he really his art was no good.
I am so jealous.
Yeah.
God, I would love to have heard Clement Greenberg speak on anything. Not that I necessarily agree with him on stuff at all. He's an old formalist, and we're all really postmodern people. But he was an old formalist, and he couldn't, he just went out, when postmodernism begins, Greenberg's reputation just collapses because he just won't give it up. He wants to hold on to that old modernist point of view, which, was dead by 65. And he just, kind of really went out of favor. But nonetheless, he's a very important voice. One of the things that he talked about was that, every medium has its own voice, that every medium seeks to express itself uniquely. He was about the purity of the medium. Painting should be painting. It should be about the paint. It shouldn't be trying to be sculpture. It shouldn't be making illusions of three-dimensional forms. Sculpture is sculpture. The properties of sculpture are this, and that's what it should focus on. Theater is theater. If you want to tell a story, don't paint a painting about a story. Write a play, write a book. They're narrative arts. If you want to show a three-dimensional space, make a sculpture. Don't make a painting and try. That's not the nature of painting. So that's an important idea that I'm going to come back to, that purity of the arts, and that's very Greenberg. Harold Rosenberg comes along a little later, also a very important writer and critic, and he's writing more really specifically about the abstract expressionist. Greenberg was writing earlier. He does write about the abstract expressionist, but Rosenberg really lays the foundation for the idea of what we call action painting. And he coins that term in 52. And when we get there, we'll talk about how he sort of defined people like Pollock and de Kooning for the world, and sort of gave them a foundation for how to understand these guys, how to look at these guys. Because frankly, this is a difficult period. This is a period where it's hard to understand these guys. Nobody understood them. They were terribly frustrated because nobody understood them. And they needed these voices to be out there to sort of speak for them, because they weren't like manifesto writers. Right? Earlier in the century, these artists would write big manifestos, right, explaining what they were doing. Well, Pollock and de Kooning and Rothko, they weren't doing that. They needed these guys, these very articulate guys, because it's a very complex thing to talk about. So let's talk about Hans Hofmann. Hans Hofmann was a very, very important bridge. He is known as a great teacher, and he taught in Europe. He's a German artist, and he ran a school in Munich for a long time. First of all, he was in Paris. Early in the century, he was in Paris. He knew and interacted with the Fauves, the Cubists, all of them there. And then right about, it was during World War I, when that started, he went back to Germany, and then he had a school in Munich until the 1930 or so. And he taught Americans there. He taught important German artists. One important American artist he taught was Louise Nevelson, who's a very important artist who studied in Munich for a while. He was Louise Nevelson. Kandinsky was in Munich too. Remember, he was part of that Munich Blue Rider group. Well, when the Russian Revolution began in 1917, Kandinsky left Munich and went back to Russia. Most Russian artists rushed back to Russia for the revolution. And Hans Hofmann stored all of Kandinsky's paintings for him while he was out of Munich. And they were very close friends. So he was very, very aware and steeped in Kandinsky's expressive style, but also the German Bauhaus sensibility. And remember, in the 20s, the Bauhaus begins in Germany. Kandinsky teaches at the Bauhaus, and his style changes to this more constructive sensibility. So Hofmann is learning the Bauhaus sensibility as well. So in 1930, he's like the first. In 1930, he's out of Germany and he comes to the US. So he has the whole 30s here. He taught at Berkeley for a while. He taught at UCLA for a while. He went to New York and taught at the Art Students League there. The Art Students League was a very important place in New York. A lot of artists studied. And then he set up his own school. He taught in New York, like from 35 to 58, he taught. And then he also had a summer school in Provincetown, which was a very important art center throughout this period. So his ideas are being spread to hundreds and hundreds of people. Two of his most important students in this country were Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock's wife, and Elaine de Kooning, Willem de Kooning's wife. So it's through both of those women that he's brought into the circle and gets to meet Pollock and de Kooning and all of the rest of them. It's his students in 1937 who founded the AAA, which is the American Abstract Artist Group, which was one of the most important and influential groups of avant-garde artists in this country at the time. And then in 58, he stops teaching to devote himself full-time to painting. Through most of the period, he was thought of as a teacher, and people didn't pay too much attention to his art. But I would say in the last 30 or 40 years, people have really gotten more interested in his art again, and particularly his late work. But I want to look at a couple of things by him and talk about his sort of aesthetic approach and how that influenced these New Yorkers.
What does he mean by the title of this?
The third hand. Interesting question. What does he mean by the third hand? What do we mean by the hand of the artist? Do you know that phrase? What does that mean when we talk about the hand? Oh, I really see the hand of the artist in this. The style. It usually means something really unique that identifies that person and nobody else. It often, not always, but it's often seen in brushwork or paint handling. Like the kind of marks you make are like your signature. That's your hand in there. Even just using that metaphor of hand of the artist takes it into a very physical realm, that it's something physical you do. It's not just your ideas are different than someone else's. It's something physically you do that's different. Now, I can't say for sure what he means. I can tell you what I think he means, because this is called the third hand. It's, first of all, it's very, very physical. It's very visceral. You see the thick paint. You can almost feel him there making those marks. It almost looks wet. And then you see the hands in the paint. So all I can do is ask questions. Is he commenting on something to do with the nature of what an artist does, the physicality of getting your hands into this work of art? Because he's very much about this dialogue with the material. One of the things he brings to this country is the Bauhaus conception of how an artist relates to his or her materials. Remember when we talked about the Bauhaus, the school in Dessau in Germany, and how they set up courses where students would just manipulate materials. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy taught this foundation course in which students just had materials like wire and cardboard and plastic and paper and whatever, and they just manipulated. They just picked it up and put it in their hands and moved it around and saw what it wanted to do. And that was a way of teaching the students to connect with the material so that the material could be a kind of collaborator. The medium becomes a collaborator in the work of art. It tells you what it wants to do, and then you work with it. It's like the second part of the formula to what a work of art is. Now, he very much embraced that idea. And for Hoffman, his goal was to reveal this inherent life within each medium. So he's a painter. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the properties of paint? What is the inherent nature of painting? It has a lot of different qualities that are very different from wood or steel or even watercolor paint or any other medium you might work in. I also want to say that Hoffman is also bringing a different way of working with the canvas. Traditionally, artists in the past, including most of the European art that we've been looking at, comes out of a process in which an artist traditionally plans something, makes a plan. Here's what I want to do. Maybe makes preliminary drawings, decides on it, and then executes. That's one way. But what if you didn't do that? What if you wanted to collaborate with your medium and allow it to contribute rather than telling it what to do? What if I ask it what it wants to do? What if I walked up to a blank canvas with all my paint and I just put a mark there? Then that mark suggests, well, Now I need one over here to balance that. And this color needs this color here. That's called a dialectic process. It's a back and forth collaboration. I do this, then I do that, then you do that. It's a different way of working. It's a very risky way of working. In fact, these artists are often referred to as sort of taking risks, and most people don't understand what that means. They think it means I'm taking a risk that you're not going to like this. That's not what the risk is. The risk is that no art's going to come out of it, because I don't know what's going to happen when I start making this. I'm just going to make this. Sometimes incredible things happen, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes nothing happens. That's the risk you're taking. But in that process, something is actually happening. Something alive is happening. It's a kind of automatism. This is something else they get from surrealism. Surrealists often took chances like that. You know, Max Ernst would do these rubbings just to see what happened, and then he would go in and develop them. That's very similar. That's an automatistic technique. What the surrealists did was called psychic automatism. They were giving up their absolute control in favor of allowing their subconscious to step in and make choices. That's psychic automatism. What these New York School artists are doing, the critics now, these writers, these guys, they're the ones that are talking about all this and giving it names. They refer to it as plastic automatism. They're not giving up control to their psyche. They're giving up control to their medium, the plastic nature of the medium. So it's an automatism. You're giving up absolute control, but to the material now, as opposed to the subconscious mind. It's a very different process, very different way of thinking about the art. So it's a focus on the formal properties of the medium itself. Very visceral piece. You know, it's interesting to compare to Kandinsky. Clearly, there's a relationship. They're abstract, they're expressive, they're emotional, but they're very, very different. Hoffman's is far more physical and gestural. This is sometimes going to be, this is what we call gestural painting. We see that more with the others, but Kandinsky's now seems rather tame. What I'm seeing here is a kind of more intellectual European approach versus a more physical American approach. Now, Hoffman may have been born in Germany, but he's brought this into the American realm, and he's really expressing something that's deeply American and physical, not as much so as the Americans are going to be. One of the things he taught in his school was depth and space, but not through traditional perspective, through what he called push and pull, which has to do with properties, again, of the paint. Because if you paint or look at paint or analyze paintings, you know that different colors have different properties, spatial properties. Warm colors warm colors come out toward you and cool colors recede. So if you put red next to blue, the blue is going to look like it's going back in space, while the red is going to look like it's coming to you. This is a natural property of color. It just is. And so he's using that. He's taking these inherent properties of the paint and the color and using them to create kind of spatial context, which is a different way of looking at and talking about. Here's a quote from him. He said, "I am often asked how I approach my work. Let me confess, I hold my mind and my work free from any association foreign to the act of painting. I am thoroughly inspired and agitated by the actions themselves, which the development of the painting continuously requires." He doesn't want to be seen as influenced by anything that's happening out there other than what he's doing right now. It's sort of an absolute presence in that moment. Now, here's a work from 42, composition, an interesting comparison to Mondrian. Now, what I'm seeing here of the sort of constructive sensibility is a bit of the sense of structure. It's not the wild and out of control. It's still sort of the free form, the expressive nature, but you see that underlying pattern, that underlying grid that is there just enough to give it a sense of structure, but still it's there. His late work is what's gets most of the attention. That's what people really seek. This is where you really see the push and pull of color, the difference between the nature of the medium, the way he's found this balance. One of the things we're going to see in these abstract expressionists is how they relate to issues of order and chaos, because that's sort of the underlying structure of life itself is chaos and order all at the same time. He is talking about how every medium wants to express itself. You know, we've got everything here. I see a little bit of everything that happened in European modernism right here, but I see it now expressed in the voice of an American movement. You've got the gestural, the mark making, the loose expressive part. You've got these sort of color fields. What color fields is going to come out of this? Color fields being these just large areas of more or less flat color that create the structure. You get this sort of physical space and placement of forms. It's all in works like these. And I think some of these last ones are beautiful. So let's talk about the Americans now, who they are, how they relate to what Hoffman's doing, and how they construct this broad movement, which we refer to as abstract expressionism. There are different types of abstract expressionism. The term is fairly clear-cut. It's abstract and it's expressive. That's about all it means, and there are many different ways to do this. The irascibles are a fascinating group. They're really, in many ways, the first real group of American artists, as far as I'm concerned. You had some American landscape painters in the 19th century who were trying to express an American land and speak about America, but they didn't develop an American style. They just spoke about America. These are the first artists to develop an American style and do so as a group. They became known as the Irascibles after a newspaper article. They came together in 1950 when the Metropolitan Museum began to construct an exhibition called American Painting Today. And what they were trying to do was to take the role. They wanted to be the voice that defined what modern painting was in America, the Metropolitan. And the Metropolitan did not have a reputation for being very supportive of or knowledgeable of more avant-garde art. That was left to the Whitney. Now, the Whitney Museum of American Art had for a long time taken the role of the voice for avant-garde art in this country. This was before the Guggenheim was the Guggenheim, while the Metropolitan focused on older, more traditional kinds of art. But the Metropolitan wasn't satisfied with that anymore. They wanted to take over and define what was good and bad and modern. The problem was they were very conservative and very anti anything abstract, and so these artists got together and protested that you know you've already eliminated everything. We're going to boycott this because your whole jury has already made it clear they're not going to even consider abstract art. And, you know, there was a big article written about it in Life magazine, which, if you remember, that was like the voice of America in 1950s. Whatever Life magazine said was important. We don't have any magazine that's that powerful today, but they were very powerful. And this photograph was in that magazine, and it really established them. And they referred to, actually, it wasn't in that article, it was in another article written about that article, a negative article, where they were referred to as the Irascibles, but the name just sort of stuck. Yeah.
Are these all artists?
Every one of them. And I can tell you who every one of them are.
Well, the woman. Who's the woman?
That's Hedda Stern. Hedda Stern, she was not the only woman. This photograph is a picture of who happened to be there on a certain day. It is not inclusive, and a lot of other women got left out because they just didn't happen to be there. But Hedda Stern is not a major figure, not as much as like Lee Krasner would be, or Elaine de Kooning, or others. We're going to look at 4 of these people. We're going to look at Willem de Kooning, who you see in the upper left. We're going to look at Jackson Pollock, who you see there in the middle. We're going to look at Mark Rothko on the right, and Barnett Newman right there in the middle. There are other really important artists in there. Jimmy Ernst is in there. Clifford Still. This is Clifford Still. We have at the Nelson an absolutely stunning Clifford Still. Great big black and white painting with the big black brush strokes on the white canvas. It's really one of his best. Yeah, it's really quite amazing. And that's Robert Motherwell over here. So a lot of important people. So this group now, actually, they weren't that tight a group. They were united by their antagonism to the Metropolitan, but they didn't join together coherently about very many other things. They mostly fought. They weren't like a coherent group. But the Irascibles were sort of part of a much larger group that formed from 48 to 50 or so, that would meet at Studio 35, also later known as the Club. This was like a Friday night thing where people would get together. It started with some lectures, people showing up, then more people started showing up. And it was in Greenwich Village on 8th Street, 35 East 8th Street in Greenwich Village. And an average of as many as 150 people would show up in one night in this loft. It was like where everything was happening. Artists, critics, musicians. It was open to absolutely anybody. It served as, quote, a physical space for everyone interested in advanced art in the United States to meet. Anybody could go there. This is where America formed its art movement, is through people like this. And people who went, Robert Motherwell went all the time. The quote from him about it, he said, there was a sense of being on the frontier, of being ahead rather than behind, of having absolutely no models, of being entirely and completely on one's own. I mean, it just seems to have been like this really heady moment where you just knew you were at the center of something important. You didn't know what was going to happen, where it was going to go, and you probably disagreed with most of the rest of the people in the room, but you all knew that this was the place to be. People who would come by, John Cage, who's one of my heroes, the great avant-garde musician and mind of the 50s and 60s, Buckminster Fuller, another great social critic who defined that moment in time. That was sort of what was happening there. So let's talk about the abstract expressionists. 2 types: gesture painting, also known as action painting, and color field. We're going to talk about 2 gesture painters and 2 color field painters. Gesture painting, first of all, rejected the impersonal constructivists. There's nothing more personal than gesture painting. To define what that means. What they take from expressionism is its personal nature, its emotional content, as you can imagine, and of course its abstract qualities. They did take from surrealism, but they took automatism, as I mentioned before. Not psychic automatism, but plastic automatism. You can see where this is coming right out of Hans Hofmann. He is the biggest influence on the gesture painters. And the first person I want to talk about is Willem de Kooning. De Kooning is a fascinating person. He's Dutch from Rotterdam. He studied, in fact, at the Academy of Fine Arts and Techniques in Rotterdam. He's classically trained. He came to this country at the age of 20. He is still an American. We consider him an American, but his European early years do show in his work, and particularly in his attachment to the figure. None of these other artists have any attachment to the human figure at all. It's not really an American thing. It's very much a European thing. European tradition in art has always been deeply rooted in the figure. And so we are going to see human figures in his work. And that really makes him stand out. Also, his sense of paint is different. He brings with him a bit more of that European, what we call the belle peinture, that French sensibility. I mentioned it earlier. It's a way of handling paint in a very sort of luscious way where you have rich colors, luscious paint handling. You see that in de Kooning more than you do certainly than a Pollock. I mean, I definitely don't see that in a Pollock at all. De Kooning is still very much a painter's painter. He was then and he is now. Someone that maybe the general public doesn't see that much in, but painters have always appreciated. Painters have always looked to de Kooning and were drawn to him. And they still very much are, more so than Pollock. Jackson Pollock's important, and we'll see for many reasons, but he's not a painter's painter. He never was. De Kooning absolutely is. This is an early work by de Kooning, The Seated Woman, and it's very much a combination of his sort of European early training and emphasis on the figure, and it's very much also the abstract expressionist struggle for resolution. The gesture painters are always struggling for resolution. You know, I've talked in this whole class about modernism as a kind of search, a quest, you know, looking for form, searching for the right forms. And in many ways, this abstract expressionist group, this last voice of modernism, because that's what they are, this is the last voice generation of modernism, are the greatest expression of that. I mean, they are the ultimate quest. And in this case, not only searching for a form, but a resolution of form as the figure sort of struggles. One of the things that Picasso understood, and I definitely see Picasso influence in here, you know, as well, and because Picasso did a lot of those figures and those sort of disoriented figures and the like. But Picasso was always very aware that whenever you distort human form, you twist it or stretch it or pull it, that creates great tension, great anxiety, because we're human beings and we're looking at a human body that's being sort of torn apart. There's a sort of inherent violence that subconsciously we read when we see a human form, you know, turned on itself and twisted on itself. And so there's a bit of that in there, but it's also the way the figure is struggling with its environment, its flatness of the picture plane, and how the figure is struggling for resolution. Like it's trying to define itself and resolve itself. You know, it has a kind of unfinished look to it, right? It doesn't, because it's not thick. He didn't always work in thick paint. He will, but a lot of his early works especially were quite thin. They were almost like thin washes where you get layering. And there's, you know, he's being influenced by another painter who we don't have time to really look at here. But nonetheless, this is still rather thinly brushed with these sort of floating arms and forms and translucency. He's struggling for resolution. But what I really want to look at is his most famous works.
I hate de Kooning.
I adore de Kooning, and I'm going to
I think
explain.
he hated women.
No, I don't buy that for one second. Let me explain what it's really about. I know I'm very aware of the whole feminist outcry, and there was a moment in time when all of that came out in the 70s and 80s when feminists were attacking absolutely everything. That doesn't mean that that's where he was coming from at all. So, but let's talk about everyone's free. See, the thing is, everyone's free to interpret art, obviously, however they want to. But as that's a heuristic approach to art, where art is, when I look at art, for me, art is what I want, what I make of the art. That's what the art is. And that's the feminists do that. That's their approach. I'm going to take it and give it my read. But I'm a historian and I can't do that. I care about one thing and one thing only: what it was when it was created, what its historical context is. I don't care what the context of the viewer is. You can go have any context you want and look at it and read it however you want. I don't do that because I'm a historian, and it matters to me what it actually was to that person who created it, what they intended it to be, not what someone else intends it thinks they want to interpret it or how they want to use it to make their own point about something. And I guarantee you he was not misogynistic, and it had nothing to do with that. It's a powerful image. Let's see where it comes from. This is woman one. Obviously, he's known totally for this more than almost anything else. 50 to 53, 6 paintings that makes a person's career. And this is the very first. This is the essence of the gesture. When I talked about gesture painting, what I'm talking about, a painting coming from the mark, that immediacy of the gesture. A gesture is not a physical thing, it's an action, right? A gesture is this. The mark you see on the canvas is the leftover remnant of that gesture. It's what I left behind after I made a gesture. So what you're seeing is paintings that every form comes from and is still sort of psychologically connected to that mark and that gesture. That's why we call it gesture art. It comes from that kind of immediacy of mark making, that back and forth commentary. When these were first shown, they were, of course, scandalous. They were seen as vulgar, fierce, ugly, monstrous. Same words that were said about Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, for the same reasons. I mean, I totally can see why you interpret them both that way, because they both sort of intended it to be that way. Other people hailed this as a figurative revival, but you got to think about the moment in time. They're seeing abstract, non-objective art everywhere and not really liking it that much. And then suddenly somebody comes along and that's a person. I recognize a person. Oh my God, there's a person. So whether you liked it or not, you recognized something and saw it, and yay, the figures are returning to art. This abstract stuff is all done now. Well, it kind of was. I mean, abstract, this is really the last gasp of non-objective art. So people felt very differently. First of all, it's a single figure struggling with its environment. I mean, this is the essence of that conflict, that chaos and conflict, where the paint itself is sort of trapped to the figure, and the figure seems to be struggling and trying to free itself from every possible direction. Now, I want to say something about sort of the female figure, because that's what we're talking about here. It's another image of the female form. The female nude has been used to mean more things in the history of art than any other single form. It is the essential symbol in art. The male nude, however, has throughout, until the modern era, has symbolized one thing and one thing only. The heroic, right? The heroic nude, that's it. Doesn't symbolize anything else, never has, till we get to the modern period. And then we saw in the romantic period, it started symbolizing different things. But female nude can be ethereal and intellectual, like we see in the Botticelli. It can be sexual, as we see by the 16th century Venetians. We saw Matisse symbolizing innocence in the dance. We saw the Romantics use the female nude to symbolize vulnerability and exposure. We saw Picasso using it to symbolize something very aggressive and confrontational. All of those things are there. What de Kooning is tapping into is something deeply, deeply primal and physical. And the closest association that we have in his works is really the oldest and the earliest. The very earliest female image ever made is the image of the nature goddess, the so-called mother goddess. These date 25,000 BCE. They're the earliest, well, they're not the earliest, they're earliest three-dimensional, because we have cave paintings that are this early, but this is certainly one of the earliest images. And it's the primal link between the earth and the female body, Mother Earth, Mother Nature. There's no Father Nature. The earth is female, always has been seen that way, always, and for obvious reasons. It's fertile. And so that link between the female body and the sort of nature goddess But he's not tapping into that particular reference. He's just using this idea as an image of something that is intensely physical and intensely primal, as a metaphor, as it struggles. You know, it almost feels like it's trapped there and is struggling with that paint to break through the surface of the form. The gesture process, struggle between figure and ground. Figure and ground is just a term we use to refer to the ground is like the background, the figure is the object. 52 is when Harold Rosenberg writes his very famous article, American Action Painting, where he says the fundamental assertion of existence, of being alive, of resisting disillusion in the chaos of modern life. He talks about these gesture painters and refers to the canvas as an arena where something is playing out, where something is happening, and that action, the making of that thing, is the art. What we're seeing here is the foundation. It's going to be carried forward farther by Pollock, but it's there a bit with de Kooning, of what will become performance art. Looking at the making of the art as the actual art, the physical making of that, you going up, doing these things, enacting something upon the canvas, that's the art. And it's just beginning right here. It's not clear yet. It will be much clearer with Pollock. This is who Rosenberg is talking about when he's talking about action painting. That's what he means. It's painting in which you are enacting almost a ritual. You know, things like that woman of Willendorf, those were sacred objects. Those were magic. Those were powerful. I mean, he's tapping into something very primal and almost shamanistic here in terms of the references that he's making. You know, in 25,000 BCE, paintings on cave walls and little handheld objects weren't for decoration. They were magic. They were powerful. Your interacting with them changed the world. And it's that power that these artists are tapping into, because I think they see themselves in a similar way, in a shamanistic manner. Woman and Bicycle, where we get, you know, a bit more sort of structure being laid out as he's searching for it. But the one that we have, of course, in the Nelson is this one, Woman 4. It's different. It's a little later. It's strangely more romantic, and I know why I feel that way, but it's less aggressive than the earlier ones. It's a bit more controlled, and the colors, I think it's the colors that to me make it feel a bit more romantic, but it's in the same vein.
Now, this is called abstract expressionism.
Yes.
Was the first one called gesture painting, or?
Gesture painting is one type of abstract expressionism.
Oh, okay.
There are, yeah. It's one type. It's both. Abstract expressionism is a broad term, no matter how you work. Gesture painting is one way of working under that umbrella.
All of his paintings are abstract.
Yes. All of everything we're going to look at today is abstract expressionism. Everything. Even things that look very different from this. After the woman series, the figure was replaced by non-objective art again, and his work changes a bit. He moved into a new studio in the East Hamptons. His late work, most people don't like his late work. It's not as popular as the woman series. It's seen as having less tension. I mean, when there's nothing there to recognize, it's hard to have the same tension that you have when you have an actual figure there. We're human beings. We interact with the human figure in a way that's different from the way we interact with anything else because we are human beings. So we have a different relationship to that. Late de Kooning also, not by 55, but certainly by the 70s, suffers from the fact that he was suffering from Alzheimer's and for quite a long time. And his work, for a long time, no one saw his work. Then it started to be shown again. And it's somewhat controversial. There have been some big exhibitions of his late work, but nobody really knows how to think about it. I mean, how do you think about it? Just because someone has Alzheimer's and can't remember what they did before, does that mean you can't look and judge the work they're making right now? I mean, I'm not sure I see that that's true. I'm not sure how relevant it is that he had Alzheimer's, because I'm not sure how much, I mean, I don't have an answer to this question, but it's something to think about. It's something that critics think about. And especially this late group, which is really quite different, you know, he's like starting off in an interesting new direction. So do we just see him as like a different person? Do we?
I see a figure.
Yeah.
I see things that look like figures. Yeah, I see figural forms, put it that way. Not a figure so much as forms that reference the figure. And I actually quite like this very last series, not the previous two, but this one I like. I like it a lot, actually, better than some of his very earlier works. But I personally think that we should acknowledge maybe the fact that he had Alzheimer's and then forget about it, because I don't care. I care about his intent, but just because he has Alzheimer's doesn't mean he can't have intention. It just means he can't remember what he did 20 years ago. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it allows him a freedom that other artists didn't have, to let their past go. I mean, seriously, maybe it does. Anyway, he died in 1997. He lived the longest of all of them, the last of the original members of the New York School. And I have really fond feelings for Willem de Kooning, because by and large, he was a much nicer guy than most of the rest of these jerks, especially Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock, I mean, where to start? We could go on about him forever and ever and ever. So much myth has been built around Jackson Pollock. I mean, I don't mean now, I mean then. You know, the mythology was building even at the time. He's certainly a gesture painter, totally unique as an individual. Many influences on his work. Certainly Thomas Hart Benton, even though he denies it, he studied with Benton for a couple of years. And you see it in the way he works with curves and counter curves, the way Benton did. You see that in his work. Maybe he just absorbed that subconsciously and didn't realize it. Certainly Hans Hofmann influence is clearly there. He's doing, you know, he's exploring the medium even more than de Kooning did, as we will see. I met him in 42, as I said, through Lee Krasner, his wife. He's influenced by the automatism of surrealism, very much so, and other things in surrealism, as we'll see. Carl Jung, we're going to talk about that. He was undergoing Jungian analysis in 39 and 40. We'll talk about Carl Jung in just a few minutes, but the symbolism of Carl Jung is very much in Pollock's early work. And he's also influenced by the mural revival, the revival of mural painting that started in the 30s and actually spread up to New York. And it's one reason why, you know, paintings get so big, you know, it's a muralist influence. But I want to talk about his early style. Number one, because it's early, and number two, because it's my favorite of his work. His totemic period. Jackson Pollock was born in Cody, Wyoming. That is the single most influential fact that people know about him. And it's the single most irrelevant fact about the man that ever existed, because he was born there. And then when he was just a like a few months old, they moved to California. I mean, he is not a Wyoming guy. And yet that fact, which got printed, formed the basis for this mystique about this man. And it's totally not true at all. And yet he does live up, he does live this mystique, but it has nothing to do with where he was born whatsoever. This is an early work, the totemic period. This period in the 40s, during the war, where he is very influenced by the Jungian archetypes. Are you familiar with Carl Jung? Anybody familiar with Carl Jung? Carl Jung was a Viennese psychoanalyst. He worked with Freud. He studied with Freud and worked with Freud, but then very visibly publicly broke with Freud early on because he didn't believe in Freud's idea of these sort of unchanging universal symbols. Freud has all these universal symbols, right? This symbolizes that symbolizes that. It's like a code book you can look up. And well, if you dream that, then it means that. Well, Jung didn't believe that sort of thing. He believed in what was called the universal subconscious, and that there are certain archetypes that we all share in this universal subconscious, but the specific forms that they might take symbolically differ depending on who we are. And while there are like 24 or something archetypes, there are 4 primary ones that he talks about the most. One of them is the self, the persona. The self is sort of who you are or believe you are. The persona is what you put out for others to see. The shadow is sort of like the unconscious. And the anima or animus has to do with the gender characteristics of male and female gender characteristics that we all have. We all have both male and female gender characteristics. And all these things can symbolically appear, but all in different ways. My dream about this may mean something totally different from your dream about that. So Jungian symbolism is quite different. And that's what Pollock is interested in. And you see these archetypal symbols in particularly this early period. We call it the totemic period. And it's different from the idea of a totem. It's totemic. It's like the difference between icon and iconic. A totem is a very specific thing. Like in Native American art, it's a symbol of power. And it can affect the world, and you have your own personal sort of totem. Sometimes it's an animal. It depends on, the clan. But totemic means sort of like that. It means it's an image that has power, that has some sort of power to affect you and affect the world. It's like an icon is a very specific kind of painting, but something is iconic if it has the properties of an icon. It's also similar to myth and mythic, and we're going to talk about that as well. A myth is a particular narrative where something mythic is when something is like a myth, meaning it's elevated to the importance of a myth. So there are a lot of these sort of language that's very similar. So male and female. It's not called man and woman. It's called male and female. Right there, he's showing us he's dealing with a Jungian archetype of male and female, not a specific, but a general concept. Now, how is he depicting these in a sort of totemic manner? Let's see what he's influenced by here and see how he pulls it together. Pollock was very interested in a lot of things. He studied a lot of things. And one of the things he was very interested in is pre-contact American art, pre-Columbian art, and Native American art, and particularly its symbolism and the way it uses totemic imagery. We know he'd been reading a lot about the Raimondi stele. The Raimondi stele is a very important artifact from Peru. from the Chavan culture, found at Chavan Tuantar. And what you see there is the stele itself, which is a big stone slab on the right. And then next to it is a drawing of what's on. It's hard to see it because it's a very shallow carving, but you can see the images. That's very, very good example of totemic imagery, where you read the forms. You could actually, well, when I actually teach this material, we look at it in more detail. I could actually flip the image over and you'd see another kind of animal image, depending on which way you look at it. What look like eyes one way, when you flip it over, they become nostrils, and what look like ears become horns. And that's very typical of totemic imagery like that. It's this powerful shamanic symbolism. Again, it's like a shaman. He's holding these shaman staffs. It's a symbol of power, of ritual, of magic. And Pollock is embracing that kind of symbolism here with his archetypal images, his forms that are, unreadable, that merge into other sorts of forms, symbols of power, primitive symbols of power as images. They combine order, but with chaos and order. That's what they all are. If you look at the Raimondi stele, it's just these chaotic images, but it's all immensely orderly as you're looking at it. And it's meant to have a kind of hallucinatory power. That huge stele, and it's quite large, was actually in an underground burial chamber below a temple, and you had to go through these winding dark passages, and then you came on this thing and the light hit, and it was like this thing where it was a scary, powerful thing, and it was meant to have that kind of power, and it certainly does have that. We see that in this one. I also like the sort of calligraphic property here. There's writing over the top, numbers. You almost see the hand moving, rapidly, just scrawling everything down. There's something in the rapidity, that has taken place here to make this image visible. And influences also like, Navajo totemic imagery. Navajo art is something else he was studying. These are totem images. You could see them as archetypes of male, female as well. Not man, woman, but male, female, ideas, concepts, powerful concepts. The other important connection to things like Navajo sand painting, for example, is the idea that it's the process that's the power. The power's in the making. These are made by shamans. They're ritually made. You're dropping the sand, moving around. The power is in the movements of your arm, the dance you're doing around the piece. It's in the making of the piece. When the piece is done, the ritual's over, you can just wipe the sand away. It's irrelevant. The power's not in the thing you leave behind. The power's in the making of the thing, the making of the image. And there's an idea that's very much connected to this process of sort of gesture painting that we see. My favorite of the totemics is Guardians of the Secret. And of course, immediately I want to know, who are the guardians and what is the secret? The title itself has this mystery, this vague reference that art somehow can access information, that there's some kind of hidden or secret knowledge that is there that can be accessed. The calligraphic line is everywhere. There are, the two vertical figures on the side are reminiscent of maybe kings or powerful figures. The horizontal figure at the bottom reminds me of a predella of an altarpiece. It looks like a wolf or a dog is lying down there. There are images that remind me of a sarcophagus form. It looks like that, like someone is writing mystical letters and words that are magic and that have power. The big red splotch up at the top is like, I don't know, blood. It's referencing in my mind 100 things, but it's not specifically stating any of them. That's what I like about it. To me, that's its connection to surrealism, is that open-endedness of it, that it's not laying out the answer for me, but it's giving me it's giving me power in the process of making more than we've seen before. And Pacific E. Now, by 43, we're seeing even more. This is real surrealist influence now. Surrealists are loud and proud in New York in 1943, and you're absolutely seeing it here in this work. Pacific E is from Greek myth. Of course, the surrealists are coming with their Freudian symbolism. He's coming with his Jungian. This is a bit almost more Freudian in its symbolism than it is Jungian, because the Minotaur was the essential symbolist of the surrealists. Pasiphae was the wife of King Minos. She, on Crete, the island of Crete, she's the one who mated with the Cretan bull, gave birth to the Minotaur and the whole Minotaur story. And remember, the surrealists embraced the Minotaur because it symbolized the merging of opposites, the two things coming together to form this sort of unholy union of opposites, which is the Minotaur. So that's what they were doing in their art, was bringing together these opposites and forming these new things. So any reference to Pasiphae is just automatically a surrealist reference. But now it's sort of floating in the air. Again, you get these totemic figures on each side. There's chaos going on. There's some bizarre things happening. We don't know what they are. There's gesture and movement everywhere. This is sort of the height, or not really the height, but to me it is, because I think it's the best. But he does continue doing totemic works for a few more years. You know, the connection to something like Picasso's Guernica is clear. That's also influenced by surrealism, the ripping apart of the figure, the twisting of the figure. There's something, you know, deeply scarring and jarring and emotional in a work like this. Powerful imagery. But by 45, things change. In 1945, he moves to his new space, moves out of Manhattan. They get the farm out in East Hampton. He gets his big studio space and starts working entirely differently. This is when everything changes. And he begins with the so-called all-over painting. This is when he begins working like on the floor with the canvas spread out on the floor. It's all over, meaning there is no figure-ground relationship. There's no orientation. He's literally moving around the canvas and working from every direction. So there's no up, down, right, left. It's a field. It's all over. And it's pure gesture now. This is the essence of pure gesture. Everything is gesture. This is not the drip paintings yet. They will happen this same year, but this one is not one. But he is creating new kinds of lines, new ways of sort of layering, and still not very big, 4.5 foot by 3.5 foot. That's not particularly large for a Pollock, but it's the beginning of these works. One of the biggest influences here now is Hoffman. Remember, he'd met Hoffman in 42. You know, this is beautiful work by Hans Hoffman from 43. I think it's one of his finest. Fantasia, where again, we get these explosions of colors, but also notice the line. What do we have here? That's actually a little dripped white line going all over. You know, Pollock gets credit for drip paintings. Hoffman's not even the first to do it. There were surrealists using drips. I mean, this was not a new idea. They were using them for different reasons. But nonetheless, you can see Hoffman being translated here into a more physical presence. Now, the real drip paintings that he's known for are the ones that begin in 47. And they really are the essence of Rosenberg's canvas as an arena. Art as a ritual, artist as a shaman is certainly how he saw himself. Jackson Pollock did not fling paint. I mean, sometimes he would, like a little bit like that, but he was amazingly controlled. He had quite an ability to control where that paint dripped. Now, why drip? Think back. These people are interested in their medium, having a dialogue with their medium, having a conversation, having the medium express itself in its purest form. What is paint above everything else is liquid. Now, for thousands of years, artists have been trying to deny that by mixing it thinly, putting it on a vertical surface, and not allowing it to do the one thing that it wants to do, which is drip. Paint wants to drip. It's dying to drip. It's begging to drip. That is its character, its whole nature. And we've been forcing it. Artists have forced it into this enclosed space to do what they want it to do. So to me, it's inherent logic of turning the paint loose is to allow it to drip, to run, to be itself. And that's absolutely what he's doing. This is no different from the dripping of the sand, making a Native American sand painting. What's interesting is, and it's not only Native American sand painting, but it's also Tibetan sand mandalas, are very similar. In both of those cases, when the art is done, the ritual is done, the image is ritually destroyed. I mean, that's that's the next step in the process. What is interesting is that people became absolutely obsessed with Jackson Pollock. First in 1949, when an article in Life magazine came out showing him working. People were never obsessed with Jackson Pollock's painting. They were obsessed with Jackson Pollock working. They wanted to see him work. That's what they wanted. What was recognized almost immediately was that when the painting was finished and you took it out of this energized artistic space and made it vertical and put it on a nice clean wall, it lost all of its energy. The energy was in the making of the piece. And it led to, by the mid 50s, people wanting to go to artist studios. This had never happened before. People wanted to see art. You went to a gallery or it hung on a wall. Now they want to go to an artist studio and they want to watch an artist make art. Now that's a really important shift and change that has happened, where I'm now interested in the process of making art. What I'm really talking about is we're like, by the time they're doing that, they're 3 or 4 years away from happenings, which begin in 58 and 59, and performance art, which follows in the 60s. They want to see performance. Jackson Pollock is giving them a performance. Even more importantly, there was a film made of him working, and a short film. Hans, God, I can't remember the guy's last name, very famous film. And people saw that, it's all they talked about. They watched, they saw, they want to go there, they want to be there, they want to experience and feel that. And that's going to lead right into performance, action-oriented art. Pollock had no idea. I mean, this was not an intentional thing. It's just a national, the outcome. Yeah.
Did people come and watch him? Did he charge to be watched?
No, he was out in Long Island. But, the filmmakers came and filmed him. Photographers came and watched him and wrote stories about him working. Anyone who could would see the films that were made. So, no, they weren't coming out to watch him. But, when happenings start, and that, you all know what happenings are, right? You're old enough to remember the happenings, right? Of the 50s, late 50s, 60s. It was just, well, that's another story. That's not modern. That's a postmodern, that's the postmodern interpretation of all of this. But those are really coming out of this. So he becomes an existential hero. And the existential hero that is constructed in all these articles is linked to this American subconscious ideal. Americans were still searching for an identity, right? And the principal identity of America in the 1950s was the cowboy, right? If you remember, every television program was a cowboy series in the 50s. There was many of them as there are like Law and Order. I find it really interesting when I see all these. We have some insatiable need to see people punished today, to see like guilty people caught and punished. And in 50 years, they're going to look at that and they're going to understand why our culture has this obsession with that it's something deeply satisfying. In the same way that the people in the 50s were obsessed with understanding who they were through all these cowboy movies and television shows and the like. So, that's for future generations to see. But all they had to do was read the words Cody, Wyoming, and that he was a hard drinking, fighting man who hung out at the Cedar Bar, was often in brawls. He was an alcoholic. I mean, watch those old cowboy shows. They're shocking today to watch when you look, because they're on TV. You can catch like old versions of whatever.
He died very young. What really died him? I don't.
Yeah, I'll get there. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. We'll get there in just a minute. But you watch those shows and, the hero is very violent. They drink constantly. The best thing, everyone cheers when they start hitting each other. I mean, it's immensely violent. I don't remember seeing it that way at the time. I don't remember really seeing it the way I see it now then, but he just fit that. I mean, that's who he was. He was that role. So he becomes this stereotype, this archetypal form. And when here's some of the Native American sand painting again. The one on the left is Cathedral. That's his first full drip painting. And then I just have another one so you can get a sense of scale. He is the absolute believer in the direct process of making art. And he raises this to a mythic level, literally, like this is the power of the imagery. He creates a new kind of line. He really is creating a new kind of line, a kind of web that you're sort of looking through, and it becomes powerfully symbolic. Lavender Mist is one of my, I'm going to say it's one of my favorites of his. But I'll be honest, none of these are my big favorites for various reasons. I mean, that's totally personal. I'm not saying there's any reason for that.
What kind of paint did he use? Just plain old?
Oil paint. They're not using acrylic yet. It's too early for acrylic.
He didn't use like, the paint you buy to paint your house.
No, but some artists did later in the 60s, commercial paints. He's using regular oil. As far as I know, he's using regular oil paint. Yeah.
Really get it, but you really have to make it liquid.
Yeah. You can dilute it down. You can dilute oil paint down to watercolor, right? And he could afford it. Jackson Pollock was always successful. These aren't starving artists.
Did he have followers?
He had a lot of collectors, supporters.
No, people who painted like he did.
No, he did not. No.
Nobody else?
Nope.
Was Lee Castor his wife?
Yes.
And she kind of.
I've got some of hers.
managed all of it?
Oh gosh, I wouldn't want her job. No, she, trying to be an artist herself and taking care of this man-child alcoholic was not an easy thing for her to have to handle. It really put her behind, her own career behind until, he died fairly young, and that allowed her to finally have her own career. But I think this one I really like. And here is a detail where you can see, this is a new form language, right? They've been searching for new forms throughout the whole 20th century. He finally really does come up with the first really new kind of form language of sort of layering of the pieces in a work like this. His late 51 black and white, he does a couple of these. He's living out on Long Island now. He actually got better for a while, stopped drinking for a little while, started drinking again, and then started really going downhill and didn't work for a long time. This is one of his last paintings, Portrait in a Dream, which is really different for him. And I can't help but see this as almost, foreboding something or some sort of understanding that something's wrong. Portrait and a dream. So which is the portrait, which is the dream, like the two selves. I see this as very psychologically rooted, maybe some Jungian symbolism in here. But, he died in an automobile accident. He was just drunk one day and just went out. But the simple fact is he was self-destructive his entire life. This wasn't just a new thing. All of the abstract expressionists suffered a lot. I mean, they suffered under the fact that nobody understood them. They suffered because what they were doing was very serious to them. And yet a lot of people accused them of not being serious. This is a joke. You're just playing around. I mean, imagine if something really, really meant something to you and you were taking all these chances of putting yourself out there. It's not easy to do. I guarantee you, it's terrifying to put something you make out there for judgment by someone else, especially when you know they're going to ridicule it and mock it. I mean, the bravery is unbelievable. I couldn't do it. And then you just get back this derision. It wasn't easy. So they all like suffered in various ways, but he was very self-destructive from the beginning. And it wasn't suicide, but clearly you don't live that life if you care about staying alive. You don't live like that. His wife, Lee Krasner, never got the attention. She actually was born in the US, but her family had just left Russia. She was Russian, escaped from Russia. She studied at the Art Students League, New York, other things, and then several years with Hans Hofmann. And she's the one that absorbed those ideas from Hofmann. She worked on the Federal Arts Project, one of the women, and I mentioned last time, she was the one who talked a lot about how powerful that experience was for her as a woman and how it finally got her kind of right in the center of what was happening, and a very important thing for her. She met Pollock in 42 and they weren't married till 45, but her career always took second place, drained her energy, her time. When they moved out to, is that the ice? It's the ice machine. Yeah, finally, it hasn't been making ice for forever.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe we could just clean that door shut. When they moved out to the Hamptons, he got the big barn to convert to his studio, and she got the little second bedroom, for her studio. It's that sort of thing the whole time. But her art, I really like her art, totally on a personal level. I'm not saying it's better, I'm not saying it's worse, because I'm not a critic. I will never make a personal judgment. I will only say what I like and what I don't like. And I totally understand that's nothing but personal. But I like her work better than his. That's just me, because I like structure. And her work has more structure to it. To me, it's a better balance of that sort of structure. This one, Noon, 24, 27, you can see a relationship between them, but they're not the same. You're never going to confuse them in any way. And I really like this one from 49, Composition. This to me, this is one of my favorites of this whole period. I just love this piece because it actually looks forward to what's going to be happening in the 60s. There's some really interesting postmodern elements in this, particularly in its modular grid, the kind of grid you have here where each little section is the same size. That's something I can talk about when we talk about postmodernism, the shift from the modernist grid, which is a hierarchy of balancing acts, to the postmodernist grid, which is like this. I just really love this. There's something magical about it. It suggests sort of a mystical language or secret meanings. Sculpture, briefly, one sculptor, David Smith. It isn't just painting. We tend to focus on painting, but there are sculptors out there trying to find sculptural equivalents. He is the most important sculptor of this generation. He used machine parts and found materials. He was a welder. He learned welding. He worked as a welder. During the war, he worked building tanks. I mean, he was like a hands-on guy out there, heavy duty, working with your metals, etc. Here's an early piece. This is not abstract expressionism. This is 38. It's clearly influenced by Picasso, Julio Gonzalez, other artists working in this period, very European, basically. In the 40s, he bought a farm in upstate New York, and it was actually a place where a lot of interesting things happened. A lot of people from New York would go up there. at different times. Here's the one in the Nelson. He did a whole series of pieces like this, which are sort of very calligraphic. They're sculpture, but they're very two-dimensional. They're very much as if they're sort of made, well, I'm sure they were made sort of lying down on the ground. You know, if you're a sculptor and you know what these painters are doing with this sort of spontaneity and these kind of lines, how do you translate that into sculpture? How do you be spontaneous with steel? I mean, that's not an easy thing to do. So he did a number of these pieces in this sort of two-dimensional way, including landscapes where you're like looking through this flat sort of landscape. But his most important series that I want to look at are the QB group, because this is where he finally sort of found a resolution to what was happening in painting. He made these from about 63 to 65. There are 28 of them in all. They are roughly, the scale is very important. They are just over life size. They're not life size, they're bigger than. With sculpture, you always have to look at that. You have to look at the relationship to the human body, because when we're relating to something, well, it's true with painting as well, but particularly sculpture, because it is three-dimensional and it is in our world. Sculpture under the scale of the human body says one thing. Sculpture over the scale says something else. Something way over the scale, what we call monumental, says something else entirely. These are very carefully chosen to be just over the human body size. And that's important in terms of how we interact with them. They're an Americanized version of modern sculpture. You know, we've looked at a lot of modern sculpture, usually smaller pieces, usually very open industrial materials, a lot of open space. That's sort of what it was. This is a more physical element of that. It's bigger, it's more physical, but it still has open spaces. It's made of steel, Corten steel, which is good for outside, and they just have numbers. And they're very precarious. They're not, but they appear to be very precarious. Now, how do you be spontaneous with steel? Or how do you create the illusion of spontaneity? That's what it is. It's the illusion of spontaneity. This is QB1. You can see the surfaces. He uses these brushed surfaces. While he does have enclosed cubes and squares and rectangles, we do not feel their mass. These do not feel heavy, solid, massive. Why? Because of the surfaces. One of the things, if you were with us way back when we did the whole Western survey, one of the things we talked about is how surface relates to mass in a solid form. If you want to draw attention away from the mass of something, you don't want it to look heavy and massive, then you draw attention to the surface of it with light decorations and details. Psychologically, you focus on the details and not the mass. We saw that in walls. We looked at some church walls that were huge, massive surfaces, but they didn't want them to feel that way. So they would cover them with these beautiful decorative tile work. And so when you looked at it, you didn't feel the weight of the mass because attention's drawn to the surface. So by using this brushed steel surface, he makes them feel hollow. They're more like boxes than they are heavy, solid forms. And that adds to the lightness that you feel.
In reality, are they solid forms?
No, they are not.
They are boxes.
They are boxes. And he makes that even more clear. You can't see it here, but the welds are very visible. He leaves the welds. I think you can kind of see it down here. This is a line of welding. So that tells you this is a plane and this is a plane, and he's welded them together, and then he brushes the surface so they feel light. They're joined.
Sorry, how large is this one?
They're all just slightly over human form. So they're all in that 8-foot range, 7 to 8 foot range. They're joined, the parts are joined in such a way that they feel precarious, like you've stopped a moment in time, like you've taken these boxes and thrown them up in the air, and then like you're freezing a moment in time just before they hit the ground. And it creates in this steel a real feeling of lightness and spontaneity that really isn't there, because these have to be, very well planned. But it's an equivalent for what is happening in the paintings. This is an interesting one as well, because again, it feels very light and precarious, like it could go at any time. And this is my favorite one. It's like, people don't actually do this, but if you've ever seen old movies where it's like Christmas and people have been out shopping and they're walking home and they're carrying all these boxes. Have you seen that? I mean, I don't know why nobody does that in reality. It's silly, but they do it in movies. And that's what it reminds me of. It's like you're carrying all these boxes in there and suddenly they're going, oh, and they start to go, and you just caught them and you just want to sort of go like that. They're fun because of that. Yeah.
Where are these?
They're all over.
Oh,
Yeah, they're in different places. A lot of them are outside because of their corten steel, so they can be placed outside. So some are still on his farm. I mean, there are like 28 of them, so they're all over the place. You never know when you're going to run into one. We've got time to do Rothko. We'll finish up Newman next time, because I don't need all of next time to do those 5 hours. So we're fine. If I can get through Rothko, that would be great. Okay, gesture painting done. Now we're going to talk about the second kind of abstract expressionist painting, and that is color field painting. And color field is an entirely different process. Everything's different, but it was still recognized as being abstract and expressive. Mark Rothko was a Russian artist, a Jewish artist. His real name is Marcus Rothkowitz, but changed it to Rothko when he came to the US in 1913 at the age of 10. So he was very young when he came. Very well educated and very knowledgeable, interest in music, philosophy, literature, mathematics. These color field painters are far more intellectual than the gesture painters. The gesture painters were more physical. The color field painters are more intellectual, and their art really shows that. It's a thoughtful art. It's a mental art. And I think because of that, they were actually hurt more. I don't think anyone was hurt more by the disrespect that he received than Mark Rothko. I think it bothered him more than anybody else. He worked on the WPA, he studied at the Art Students League, the usual path, briefly turned to mythology. Now here's an early piece right after he had just left the Federal Arts Project. So this is not part of that, but it's still a painting that still has that realist sensibility, coming out of that era. It's still 38. I really like this little painting. I think of this painting, the subway scene, I call this post-abstract realism. And what I mean by that is there's realism before abstraction existed, but then after abstraction exists and everybody knows about it, you can't be a realist in the same way because you've been affected by what you've seen and what you know of abstract art. And you treat forms differently, even as a realist. And I see the influence of abstraction in here very strongly in the way he's composed the scene, in the planar. It's planar, everything's parallel to the picture plane. It's constructed of these repetitions of rectangles. I see Mondrian in here. I see a strong influence of Mondrian very early on, the constructivist in general, but it's still realism, but it's now seeing the world through a different lens, through a lens in which you're now more aware of shapes. You're more aware of how shapes create meaning within a work of art. So that's why I call it post-abstract realism, although I haven't seen anybody else ever do that. That's what it is. And I happen to really like this piece. Like Pollock, he is caught up in the surrealists, the presence of the surrealists. While they are in town, their mythologies. He was someone in 43 involved with Adolf Gottlieb in a letter. They were getting terrible criticism. The critics were writing horrible things about their work. And basically they were clearly saying things like, well, this work isn't about anything, it doesn't mean anything. And that's why they felt the need to write a letter. It's a very famous letter to the New York Times in which they said, there's no such thing as good painting about nothing. We favor the simple expression of the complex thought. Now, that's an important statement because it tells us so much about what people were thinking at the time. It tells us what critics were saying about their work. It tells us what they thought about the critics and what they felt they needed to explain. And it says that critics didn't understand that there's meaning in something other than realism, that there can be meaning in there. Even something that's very simple can have meaning. You can express a complex idea. And to me, this is something you could say about Mondrian, about the Russians. Those are works of art that seem really simple, right? It's just some red squares. But it doesn't mean it doesn't have any meaning, that there's not a very complex idea behind that. And that's what they're trying to say. That's why we read everything someone writes and letters in the press and what critics say, because they reveal so much about a moment in time. Rothko was always interested in universal themes, important themes, influenced by the symbolists in that way, as so many were, influenced by Nietzsche and influenced by Jung as well, influenced by the idea of the tragic hero in his work. A number of paintings by both Rothko and Newman deal with specific religious imagery, but they're not dealing with it as a specific religious message. This is called the entombment. It's clearly linked to a long tradition of images of the entombment of Christ in one way or another, but it's not a Christian image. It's a metaphor. It's an image about the idea of human suffering, human tragedy. It's just using that almost as a mythic quality. It's taking this idea of the tragic hero. Christ is just one more of 1,000 tragic heroes in literature. That's what they're looking at. It just happens to be one that's very well known, and so we'll use that as the metaphor. So the impact here is of surrealism to me is obvious. There are references not only to Christ in the tomb, but also to a Pietà image. It looks more like a Pietà image to me, where Mary is holding the adult Christ in her lap, that invented image after the entombment. Surrealism, it's the vocabulary of surrealists. It's not surrealism because it has nothing to do with his subconscious mind whatsoever. However, it's the language of surrealism, the forms, the fluid forms, the liquid forms, trying to create these again, sort of totemic images to communicate. Moreau, Ernst, they're all using very similar sorts of forms. What we know Rothko for more, however, is what begins in 46, 47. This is exactly the same time Pollock is making his transition. Is this a coincidence that these Americans have a big sort of leap forward in 46, 47? Heck no, that's when the Europeans left. The Europeans left. It is when I hit the table that's doing that. It must have something to do with this connection. Europeans go home, 46. Americans are now not as influenced directly by them. They've also matured. They're a little older. They're at the point where they're ready to make their break and move into their art. That's when Pollock starts moving into the drip paintings in 47. It's when Rothko moves into the multiforms, his own abstraction. I love these early multiforms. Color fields are beginning, these large fields of color that speak of sort of emptiness, space. It's very different from the loud voice. The gesture painters are loud. The color field painters are quiet. It's a different formal language because it's a totally different place that things are coming from. So he begins layering these forms using these thin washes. Now, this is oil using very thin washes, but he was actually also playing with actual watercolor, and that does influence his thin washes here, layering his works. These are the paintings that we think of when we think of Rothko and his works. This is number 3. These are about space more than they're about color. I do have the dimensions here. These are very similar in scale to David Smith's sculptures, maybe a little bit smaller, but they're just slightly over human scale, which gives them a power, a presence, but not an overwhelming power. It doesn't totally dwarf you. He's creating an environment, and I'm going to move on to the one that I want to talk about because again, my favorite one. Beginning in 1950, he begins his trips to Europe. His first trip is in 1950, and then he goes back again several more times. And he's going to Europe not to go look at European modernism, but to go particularly to Italy to look at Renaissance art. Renaissance art is one of the biggest influences on these paintings, particularly in frescoes, the large frescoes, and the environments that a fresco creates in a room. He was obsessed with this idea of creating an environment, a space with these very sort of iconic figures. He was particularly inspired by the frescoes of Fra Angelico. And Fra Angelico was a monk, a Dominican monk, who painted these frescoes in monasteries, and they're large. He would paint many of them, and they were associated with prayer. They were iconic. They were meditational. When you passed them, you said certain prayers. The monks would say certain prayers. And this, more than anything, is what's feeding Rothko, is this kind of painting, this kind of iconic role. Not totemic, but iconic. Now, for Pollock, they were totemic. They were these symbols of power that could speak to you. These are iconic, and icons are quiet images of meditation that still the mind and quiet the mind, that suggest revelation, revelation of knowledge, secret knowledge. And I love these details. These are the paintings that they're so physical in their own way, but not in like a Pollock de Kooning way. They're not an aggressive physicality. It's a quiet, sensual physicality. You know, corners like this, where you get this layering. To me, this is a quiet space as opposed to the loud music of a Pollock and de Kooning. It's a meditational space. You know, this layering of colors with this sort of yellow peeking around is like light. It reminds me of like the gold leaves of icons. When we studied medieval icons and looked at gold leaf and then the colors on the gold leaf, and the gold leaf symbolizes this spiritual realm, and it took you out of the real world, the everyday. So this is transcendence. They're interested in meditation, but not, you know, Christian meditation or Buddhist meditation. It's transcendental meditation. It's a transcendent form. And these sort of flowing images, floating clouds that layer and react are, to me, powerfully emotional. And I don't have that much reaction to non-objective art. That's not really something that I respond to as strongly as some other people do. But these do. This is about the only non-objective art that I have intellectual connections with a lot of it, and I appreciate it intellectually very much. But emotionally, these are the only ones that I connect with on an emotional level because of their meditational properties. It's, you know, his work also deals a lot with death. Rothko did commit suicide, died by suicide. I gotta learn to use the correct language now. And he had reasons, you know, he had so many reasons. He had such a hard life and so many horrible things, accidents that he was in, his wife dumped him, his studio burned, he lost all his art. I mean, you know, it's just one thing on top of another. The critics, he struggled with acceptance. He is archetypal abstract expressionist in that way. So his preoccupation with death is visible in a lot of his later work. And I see it in something like this. He said, all art deals with intimations of mortality, which is an interesting idea because a lot of other people historically have talked about that, linking the idea of creativity and death, and the idea of in the human soul, we create because of our mortality. We create things, we create other little people, we create because we are mortal. I mean, that's an interesting philosophical thing that I won't go into, but he's not the first to link that idea of creation with death. But looking at these works, how do these works how do they work formally? And that's a good question. Color and it becomes a dialogue between color and scale and various shapes. They do sort of take a high moral tone. They're meant to do that. There are no frames to set them from the environment. He never uses a frame. None of these artists use frames. This is something new. We're used to seeing art in frames. We don't think about it because when I show you art, I crop out the frames. But when you go to museums, you become very conscious of the frames. And this is when you would begin to recognize, wow, these guys don't have frames on their art, because you would have just come from rooms where they still have these big frames. What frames do is they separate art from the world. Frames serve a function. They say, within this, there's art. In here is art, out there is life. But if you remove those frames, you take away that barrier, that difference. Same is true with sculpture. I don't know if you've really thought about it before, but pedestal for sculpture functions the same way a frame does for a painting. When you put a sculpture on a pedestal, you're creating an imaginary sort of space, and you're saying, this is art and that's not art. And that's why it was very dramatic when artists took sculpture off a pedestal and put it on the floor. It's the same thing as, you're putting it in the world now, not in an elite space. Same thing's happening here. It creates auras around them. Notice what we don't have, and that is hard edges. These are like clouds. These are like nimbuses that float in the air. They make a really interesting comparison to other works that, it's very natural to see this as a progression. And without a doubt, there is a relationship. They're working with color fields, but there are more differences than there are similarities. That hard edge is not unimportant. It's very important because it changes the whole figure-ground relationship. It makes them, strong statements, where these are mystic things, not strong forms. So they're meant to be meditational. He wanted them to be shown hung close together and right down at floor level. He didn't want them hung up in the air, and he didn't want them far apart. He wanted to create that Renaissance space, right? Where you walk into this Renaissance 15th century room and the walls are all completely covered. And so you're absorbed within that space. What he's really setting up and defining is kind of installation art, which is another postmodern idea, where you walk into an exhibition space and it sort of circles you. So all of these guys are looking forward to where art is going in the future. And I'm not going to, we'll do Barnett Newman next time and pick up on several new artists that we missed and move on to a few other people, and then we'll be ready to wrap up postmodernism. So I will see you all next week.